My name is David Miller. As I sit here in my modest home in rural Missouri, looking out at the small garden my wife Rachel and I have painstakingly cultivated over the past few years, I find it hard to believe that we once lived in what was supposed to be the spiritual center of the universe. For 36 years of our lives, the prime years, the years when most people build careers, raise families, and establish their place in the world, we lived behind the walls of Bethel, the world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses. This is my story. It's a story of faith manipulated, of dreams deferred and ultimately shattered, of a young couple who gave everything they had to an organization that promised them spiritual paradise but delivered something far different. It's the story of how two devoted believers gradually awakened to the reality that they had been living not in God's house, but in a carefully constructed prison where obedience was demanded, questioning was forbidden, and human dignity was systematically stripped away in the name of spiritual service. I write this not out of bitterness, though there is pain here that may never fully heal. I write this because I believe others deserve to know the truth about what life is really like behind the carefully maintained facade of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. I write this for the young people who, like I once was, are considering dedicating their lives to full-time service at Bethel. Most of all, I write this for Rachel and myself, as a way of processing and finally beginning to heal from an experience that stole our youth, our health, our dreams of family, and nearly our sanity. I was born and raised in Springfield, Missouri, in 1963, in a time when America still felt like a place where hard work and faith could carry you through anything. My childhood was typical of many Midwestern families in those days, simple, structured, and deeply religious. My father, William Miller, was a respected elder in our local Kingdom Hall, known throughout the circuit for his powerful talks and unwavering devotion to the organization. My mother, Margaret, was a pioneer who spent 70 hours a month going door to door, placing literature and conducting Bible studies with interested ones. From my earliest memories, the rhythm of our family life was dictated by the meetings, conventions, and service requirements of the Watchtower organization. Tuesday evenings were reserved for the Theocratic Ministry School, Thursday evenings for the congregation book study, and Sundays for the public talk and Watchtower study. Saturdays meant field service, long mornings walking through neighborhoods, knocking on doors, enduring rejections and occasional hostility, all in the name of spreading the good news of God's kingdom. I was the eldest of 3 children, and from an early age, it was clear that great things were expected of me spiritually. While my younger siblings showed typical childhood rebelliousness, questioning why we couldn't celebrate birthdays or Christmas, why we had to sit through long meetings when other kids were playing, I embraced the restrictions and requirements with an enthusiasm that delighted my parents and impressed the other adults in our congregation. By the time I was 10 years old, I was already giving talks from the platform during the Theocratic Ministry School. I memorized vast portions of Scripture, could recite the organization's teachings on any number of doctrinal points, and spent my weekends eagerly participating in field service. While other boys my age were playing Little League baseball or joining Boy Scouts, I was studying Watchtower and Awake magazines, preparing for parts on the circuit assembly program, and dreaming of the day when I might be privileged to serve at the very center of God's earthly organization. The dream of serving at Bethel was planted in my mind during a district convention when I was 14 years old. A member of the governing body gave a talk about the privilege of full-time service, describing Bethel as a spiritual paradise where devoted Christians could dedicate their entire lives to supporting the worldwide preaching work. He painted a picture of brotherhood, simplicity, and divine purpose that captured my imagination completely. Imagine, he said, his voice carrying across the packed convention center, waking up each morning knowing that every moment of your day will be spent in direct service to Jehovah God. Imagine working alongside the faithful men who are taking the lead in God's organization, being present as new light unfolds, participating in the production and distribution of spiritual food for God's people worldwide. This is not merely a job or a career. This is a calling to the highest form of service possible in this old system of things. I remember sitting in that convention seat, transfixed by his words, feeling what I believed to be the Holy Spirit moving me to dedicate my life to this noble purpose. I turned to my parents with tears in my eyes and whispered, "That's what I want to do with my life. I want to serve at Bethel." My parents beamed with pride. My father placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Son, if that's truly where your heart is leading you, then we'll do everything we can to help you prepare for that privilege." From that moment forward, my entire life was oriented around the goal of becoming a Bethelite. I threw myself into my studies of the Bible and Watchtower literature with even greater intensity. I auxiliary pioneered during school vacations, spending up to 90 hours a month in field service. I sought out opportunities to serve wherever they were needed, cleaning the Kingdom Hall, working on quick-build Kingdom Hall construction projects, helping with circuit assembly preparations. During my senior year of high school, while my classmates were filling out college applications and planning their futures, I was focused solely on preparing my application for Bethel service. The organization's literature had made it clear that higher education was not only unnecessary for those called to spiritual service, but actually dangerous, a potential source of pride and worldly thinking that could weaken one's faith and dedication. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, called me into her office one afternoon near the end of my senior year. She was a kind woman who had taught at the school for over 20 years and had watched many students struggle with important life decisions. "David," she said, spreading my academic records across her desk, "you're one of the brightest students I've worked with in years. Your SAT scores are excellent, your grades are outstanding, and you have a real gift for writing and communication. Have you given any thought to college? I could help you apply for scholarships that would make it very affordable." I politely but firmly declined. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, but I've already chosen my path. I'm going to serve at the world headquarters of my religion. College would just be a distraction from what God wants me to do with my life." She looked at me with a mixture of sadness and frustration that I didn't understand at the time. "David, you're 18 years old. Don't you think you should keep your options open? You could always pursue religious service after getting an education. In fact, an education might make you even more effective in whatever ministry you choose." But I had been thoroughly indoctrinated in the organization's teachings about the dangers of higher education. I believed that college was a worldly pursuit that would weaken my faith and fill my mind with human philosophy instead of divine truth. I believed that the end of the system of things was so close that spending 4 years in college would be a waste of precious time that could be spent in service to God. "I appreciate your concern," I told her, "but I know what God wants me to do." As I walked out of her office that day, I felt proud of my decision, confident that I was choosing the narrow path that leads to life while my classmates were being deceived by Satan's world into pursuing material success instead of spiritual riches. I had no way of knowing that I was making a decision that would trap me in a life of poverty, control, and exploitation for the next 4 decades. It was during the spring of my final year in high school that I met Rachel Thompson at a circuit assembly in Kansas City. She was 17, the daughter of a presiding overseer from a congregation about 60 miles from ours, and everything about her seemed to embody the qualities that the organization taught us to look for in a marriage mate. Rachel was beautiful in a wholesome, unpretentious way. She had long brown hair that she wore simply, often in a braid down her back, and expressive hazel eyes that seemed to reflect a deep inner spirituality. She was modest in her dress and demeanor, never seeking attention for herself but always ready to encourage others. She was a regular pioneer, having started full-time service immediately after graduating from high school, and she spoke about her field service experiences with a genuine enthusiasm that was infectious. We met during the lunch break, introduced by mutual friends who thought we might have a lot in common. We spent the rest of the assembly finding excuses to talk to each other, comparing notes on the talks, discussing the new publications that had been released, sharing experiences from our respective congregations. By the time the 3-day assembly was over, I knew I wanted to see her again. The organization had strict guidelines about courtship, emphasizing that dating should only occur between those who were serious about marriage and that all romantic relationships should be conducted with marriage as the goal and with appropriate chaperonage to maintain moral purity. There was no casual dating, no getting to know someone gradually through friendship. If you were interested in someone, it meant you were considering them as a potential marriage partner. I spoke to my father about Rachel, and he agreed to contact her father to arrange for us to spend time together under proper supervision. Over the next several months, we saw each other at assemblies, conventions, and arranged visits between our congregations. We took long walks with her younger sister trailing behind as a chaperone, discussing our spiritual goals, our understanding of Bible principles, and our shared dream of serving together in full-time ministry. Rachel shared my enthusiasm for Bethel service. She had also been moved by the talks about the privilege of serving at the world headquarters, and she spoke with genuine excitement about the possibility of dedicating her life completely to supporting the worldwide preaching work. Unlike many young sisters who seemed primarily focused on finding a husband and starting a family, Rachel genuinely seemed to view marriage as a partnership in spiritual service rather than an end in itself. I've never really understood sisters who just want to get married and have children right away, she told me during one of our chaperoned walks through the park near her family's home. I mean, children are a gift from Jehovah, but think about what we could accomplish if we dedicated our entire lives to His service while we're young and energetic. We could really make a difference in the preaching work. I was completely smitten, not just with her beauty but with her spiritual maturity and dedication. Here was a young woman who shared my highest aspirations, who understood that material success and conventional family life were insignificant compared to the privilege of serving at the very center of God's earthly organization. We were both 19 when I proposed to her, kneeling in her parents' living room with both sets of parents present as witnesses. It was February 1983, and I had just received my acceptance letter for Bethel service. My application had been approved, and I was scheduled to report to Brooklyn in June, immediately after our wedding. "Rachel," I said, my voice trembling with emotion as I held out the simple gold band I had purchased with money saved from my part-time job at a local grocery store, "I believe that Jehovah has brought us together for a purpose. Will you marry me and join me in serving at Bethel? Will you dedicate your life to supporting God's organization as my wife and partner?" Through tears of joy, she said yes. Both sets of parents embraced us, and we spent the evening making plans for a simple wedding ceremony at her family's Kingdom Hall, followed immediately by our departure for our new life at the world headquarters. Our engagement period was brief and strictly supervised. We met with the elders for premarital counseling, studied the organization's literature about Christian marriage, and prepared ourselves mentally and spiritually for the challenges and privileges that awaited us at Bethel. We spoke often about the sacrifices we would be making, the decision to postpone having children indefinitely, the commitment to live simply on the modest allowance provided to Bethel workers, the surrender of personal ambitions in favor of organizational service. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel's mother asked her one evening, just a few weeks before our wedding. "You're so young, honey. There's no shame in waiting a few years, maybe having a normal marriage first before taking on such a big commitment." But Rachel was resolute. "Mom, I've prayed about this constantly. I know this is what Jehovah wants for my life. David and I can serve Him so much better together than we ever could apart, and serving at Bethel will give us opportunities to support His organization that we could never have in a local congregation." I felt the same way. I believed that our love for each other was a gift from God, but that it was secondary to our love for Him and our commitment to His organization. I believed that by putting kingdom interests first, we would be blessed with a marriage that was not only happy but spiritually exemplary. Our wedding took place on May 28, 1983, in a simple ceremony at Rachel's Kingdom Hall. About 150 friends and family members attended, and the talk given by the elder who performed the ceremony emphasized our dedication to spiritual service above personal happiness. Instead of a honeymoon, we spent our first week as a married couple visiting congregations in the area, sharing our excitement about our upcoming Bethel assignment and encouraging young people to consider full-time service. A week later, we loaded our few possessions into my father's pickup truck and made the long drive from Missouri to Brooklyn. We were both nervous and excited, talking constantly about the new life that awaited us, the responsibilities we would be given, the privilege of serving alongside the governing body members we had only seen from a distance at conventions. As we crossed the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and caught our first glimpse of the Brooklyn skyline, with a Watchtower building standing prominently among the industrial landscape of Brooklyn Heights, I felt a sense of fulfillment and purpose that I had never experienced before. This was it, the beginning of our life of dedicated service to Jehovah God. I had no way of knowing that we were driving toward what would become a 36-year prison sentence, disguised as the highest privilege available to faithful Christians. Our first glimpse of Bethel was overwhelming. The complex of buildings that housed the world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses was larger and more impressive than we had imagined. The main building at 124, Columbia Heights, stood 8 stories tall, its red brick facade weathered but imposing against the Brooklyn sky. Connecting buildings and annexes spread out across several city blocks, housing printing facilities, offices, residences, and all the infrastructure necessary to support the worldwide activities of the organization. We reported to the reception desk in the main building, where a middle-aged brother in a dark suit checked our names against a list and handed us temporary identification badges. "Welcome to Bethel," he said with a practiced smile. "You'll be meeting with Brother Patterson this afternoon for your orientation. In the meantime, Sister Williams will show you to your room and give you a brief tour of the facilities." Sister Williams was a woman in her 50s who had been at Bethel for over 20 years. She was efficient and friendly in a professional way, but there was something in her manner, a certain weariness behind her smile, that I noticed even in those first moments but chose to ignore. She led us through a maze of corridors, pointing out dining rooms, laundry facilities, recreation areas, and the library. The most important thing to remember, she said as we walked, is that Bethel operates like a well-organized family. Everyone has their responsibilities, everyone follows the schedule, and everyone works together for the common good. You'll find that life here is very structured, but that's what allows us to accomplish so much for the kingdom. Our room was on the 4th floor of one of the residential buildings. It was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a narrow window that looked out onto an interior courtyard. The furnishings were sparse but functional: a double bed, a small desk, 2 chairs, a dresser, and a tiny closet. The walls were painted institutional green, and the floor was covered with worn linoleum. "This will be your home for as long as you're privileged to serve here," Sister Williams said. "You'll find that having fewer material possessions actually makes life simpler and allows you to focus on what's really important." Rachel and I looked at each other and smiled. We had expected simplicity, and we welcomed it. We had been living in abundance compared to this back in Missouri, but we truly believed that giving up material comfort was a small price to pay for the privilege of serving at the center of God's organization. That afternoon, we attended our formal orientation with Brother Patterson, a member of the Bethel family who was responsible for overseeing new arrivals. He was a thin man in his 60s with graying hair and intense eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke with the authority of someone who had spent decades within the organization's hierarchy. "Brothers and sisters," he began, addressing our group of 12 new arrivals, "you have been selected for Bethel service because the organization recognizes in you the qualities necessary for this special form of dedicated service. You are here not because you sought an easy life, but because you have demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice personal comfort and ambition for the sake of kingdom interests. Let me be clear about what you can expect during your time here," he continued, pacing slowly in front of our small group. "Bethel is not a vacation, and it's not a retreat. This is a working facility where we produce literature that feeds God's people spiritually and supports the most important work happening on earth today, the preaching of the good news of God's kingdom. Your days will begin at 6:30 a.m. with morning worship. Breakfast is served from 7 to 7:45. Work assignments begin promptly at 8 o'clock and continue until 5 p.m., with a 1-hour break for lunch. Evening meals are served from 5:30 to 6:30, followed by personal study time. Lights out is at 10:30 p.m. This schedule will be your life Monday through Friday. Saturdays are reserved for field service in the local congregations, and Sundays for meeting attendance and personal preparation. You will be assigned to a local congregation where you will be expected to participate fully in all activities, just as you did in your home congregations. There are rules here, and they exist for good reasons. Bethel family members are not permitted to have personal vehicles. You will not leave the premises without permission from your overseer. Personal relationships between unmarried brothers and sisters are strictly monitored and must be conducted according to the guidelines you will receive. Married couples are expected to maintain proper priorities, remembering that your primary relationship is with Jehovah and his organization. Most importantly, you must understand that questioning or criticizing the decisions of your overseers or the policies of the organization is not acceptable. We operate on the principle of theocratic order. Just as Jehovah God has his arrangement in heaven, he has established an arrangement on earth. Your job is to submit to that arrangement and support it with your whole heart. As Brother Patterson spoke, I felt a mixture of excitement and slight unease. The schedule he described was more rigid than I had expected, and his emphasis on submission and obedience was stronger than what I had heard in the public talks about Bethel service. But I pushed aside any doubts, reminding myself that this was exactly the kind of dedication and organization necessary to accomplish such important work. After the orientation, Rachel and I were given our work assignments. I was assigned to the bindery department, where I would help with the final stages of book and magazine production. Rachel was assigned to the housekeeping department, specifically the laundry facility that served the entire Bethel family. "Consider these assignments a privilege," Brother Patterson told us as he handed us our assignment cards. Many longtime Bethel family members have never been given the opportunity to work directly in the production of spiritual food. You'll be handling literature that will eventually reach the hands of God's people all over the world. My first day in the bindery was a shock to my system. I reported to the factory floor at exactly 8 a.m., where I was met by Brother Rodriguez, the department overseer. He was a stocky man in his 40s who had been at Bethel for 15 years and carried himself with the authority of someone who had climbed the organizational ladder through strict adherence to rules and expectations. "Miller," he said, barely looking up from his clipboard, "you'll be working Station 7. Your job is to collate signatures for the new book releases. The quota is 1,200 units per day. Any questions?" I was led to a workstation consisting of a long table surrounded by bins filled with printed pages. My job was to take one page from each bin in sequence, stack them in order, and place the completed signature in a box for the next stage of production. It was simple, repetitive work that required no skill or creativity, just speed and endurance. The pace was relentless. Within the first hour, my back was aching from bending over the table. By lunchtime, my feet were throbbing from standing in one position for hours. The noise level in the bindery was constant and overwhelming, the sound of machinery, conveyor belts, and dozens of workers performing similar repetitive tasks. "You'll get used to it," said Brother Jackson, the worker at the station next to mine. He was in his 30s and had been at Bethel for 8 years. "The first few weeks are the hardest, but your body adapts. Just keep your mind focused on the importance of what we're doing here." But even Brother Jackson looked worn down. His shoulders were permanently stooped from years of bending over his workstation, and he had developed a persistent cough from breathing the dust and chemical fumes that filled the air. When I asked him if he enjoyed his work, he gave me a look that I would come to recognize in many long-term Bethel workers, a mixture of resignation and forced enthusiasm. "Enjoy," he repeated. "Brother, this isn't about enjoyment. This is about service to Jehovah." When you see these books and magazines in the hands of publishers in the field, when you hear about people whose lives have been changed by the truth contained in these pages, that's when you understand why we do what we do. Meanwhile, Rachel was struggling with her own challenges in the laundry facility. The work was physically demanding and took place in conditions that were hot, humid, and filled with chemical fumes from the industrial washing machines and dryers. She was responsible for processing hundreds of pounds of laundry daily: sheets, towels, work clothes, and personal items from the Bethel family members. The laundry operated on the same principle as the bindery: quotas, speed, and efficiency above all else. Rachel worked alongside a crew of mostly sisters, many of whom had been performing the same tasks for years or even decades. The constant heat and humidity left her exhausted, and the chemical exposure began affecting her breathing within the first few weeks. "I try to think of each load as a way of serving our brothers," she told me one evening as we sat in our small room, both of us too tired to do much more than compare our aches and pains. "But David, I never imagined it would be this hard physically. I feel like I'm in a factory, not a spiritual paradise." I tried to encourage her, reminding her of the talks we had heard about the privilege of serving at Bethel, but privately I was having similar thoughts. The romanticized picture of life at the world headquarters that had been painted in the organization's literature bore little resemblance to the industrial reality we were experiencing. The weekends provided little relief. Saturdays were consumed by field service requirements, and we quickly learned that Bethel family members were expected to be exemplary in their door-to-door work. Our hours and placements were carefully monitored, and falling behind the congregation average was seen as a sign of weak spirituality that could affect our standing at Bethel. Sundays meant attending meetings at our assigned congregation, where we were expected to comment regularly, participate in the school, and maintain the same level of spiritual activity we had shown in our home congregations. But after working 60 hours in the factory and spending Saturday morning in field service, we often found ourselves struggling to stay awake during the meetings. "You need to adjust your attitude," Brother Patterson told me during our 3-month review. "Your department overseer reports that while your work output is adequate, you don't seem to have the proper appreciation for your assignment. Remember, Brother Miller, thousands of young men would give anything to have the privilege you've been given." I assured him that I was grateful for the opportunity to serve, but his words stung because they contained an implicit threat. I was beginning to understand that expressions of gratitude and enthusiasm were not just encouraged at Bethel, they were required. Any sign of discontent or questioning could be interpreted as spiritual weakness and could result in dismissal from the Bethel family. As the months passed, Rachel and I began to notice the stark contradictions between the organization's public teachings about equality and brotherhood and the reality of life within Bethel's walls. While the literature spoke of all Christians being equal in God's eyes, the hierarchical structure at Bethel was rigid and unforgiving. At the bottom of the hierarchy were workers like us, young, recent arrivals who performed the manual labor necessary to keep the organization functioning. We lived in the smallest rooms, ate in the largest and most crowded dining halls, and had virtually no input into the decisions that governed our daily lives. Above us were the department overseers and their assistants, many of whom had worked their way up through years of faithful service and careful attention to organizational politics. They enjoyed better room assignments, more flexible schedules, and the privilege of eating in smaller, quieter dining areas. Higher still were the factory overseers, branch office personnel, and writing department staff. These brothers had access to private offices, personal secretaries, and dining facilities that were completely separate from the general population. They drove organizational vehicles, traveled frequently on business, and lived in apartments that were significantly larger and better appointed than the rooms assigned to regular workers. At the very top were the members of the governing body and their immediate staff. They lived in virtual luxury compared to the rest of us, with spacious private quarters, personal attendants, chauffeurs, and dining arrangements that bordered on extravagant. They traveled first class, stayed in the best hotels when attending conventions, and enjoyed medical care and other benefits that were completely unavailable to the rank-and-file Bethel workers. "Have you ever noticed," Rachel whispered to me one evening as we walked past the governing body dining room, "that their meals are prepared by professional chefs while we eat cafeteria food? That doesn't seem very much like the equality Jesus taught about." But such observations had to be kept private. Any expression of dissatisfaction with the living conditions or treatment of different levels of workers was quickly labeled as murmuring and could result in serious consequences. We learned to keep our questions and doubts to ourselves, expressing only gratitude and enthusiasm when speaking with overseers or in any public setting. The favoritism extended beyond just living conditions. Advancement within the Bethel hierarchy was not based solely on spiritual maturity or length of service, but often on personal relationships and political skills. Brothers who were good at cultivating friendships with the right people, who knew how to present themselves favorably to those in authority, and who never questioned or criticized organizational policies found themselves moving up to better assignments with surprising speed. I watched as brothers with less experience and no greater spiritual qualifications were promoted to oversight positions while long-term workers remained in the same menial jobs year after year. The key seemed to be complete submission to the organizational structure and an ability to anticipate and cater to the preferences of those in authority. "It's just like any other business," confided Brother Matthews, a man in his 40s who had been at Bethel for 12 years and had watched dozens of younger men advance past him. "The ones who get ahead are the ones who know how to play the game. Spirituality has less to do with it than you might think." Brother Matthews worked in the shipping department, loading trucks with literature bound for congregations around the world. He was a sincere, hard-working man who had sacrificed marriage and family to serve at Bethel, but his inability or unwillingness to engage in organizational politics had kept him trapped in the same position for over a decade. "Don't get me wrong," he added quickly, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "I'm grateful for the privilege of serving here. But sometimes I wonder if this is really what Jesus had in mind when he talked about his followers loving one another." Such conversations were rare and always conducted in whispers, but they revealed a level of disillusionment among the Bethel family that was carefully hidden from public view. Many long-term workers harbored doubts and frustrations that they could never express openly without risking their positions and the only life they had known for years or decades. As our first year at Bethel progressed, the full extent of the control exercised over every aspect of our lives became increasingly apparent. The organization's demand for absolute obedience extended far beyond our work assignments and into the most intimate details of our personal lives. Married couples like Rachel and myself were subject to specific guidelines about our relationship that went far beyond biblical principles and into areas that seemed invasive and inappropriate. We were expected to maintain proper priorities, which meant that any expression of affection or attention to each other that might be perceived as excessive could be criticized as evidence of spiritual immaturity. "Your primary relationship is with Jehovah God and His organization," we were reminded regularly. "Marriage is a gift, but it must never interfere with your service or become more important than your spiritual responsibilities." This philosophy was enforced through a system of observation and reporting that made privacy virtually impossible. Our room assignments were deliberately designed to minimize privacy. Thin walls, small spaces, and proximity to other couples meant that any argument, intimate conversation, or expression of frustration could be overheard and potentially reported to the overseers. We were subject to unannounced room inspections that were ostensibly about cleanliness and organization, but often felt like invasions of our personal space. Personal possessions were expected to be minimal and appropriate. Too many books, magazines, or personal items could be seen as evidence of materialism or misplaced priorities. The guidelines for intimate relations between married couples were particularly intrusive and demoralizing. We were expected to follow specific rules about frequency, timing, and even methodology that seemed to have no basis in Scripture but were presented as organizational wisdom that we were required to accept without question. "Remember," advised Brother Patterson during one of his mandatory talks to married couples, "that even your private life should reflect your dedication to Jehovah. Excessive focus on physical intimacy can distract from spiritual pursuits and weaken your effectiveness in service." These teachings created an atmosphere of guilt and confusion around what should have been a natural and joyful aspect of marriage. Rachel and I found ourselves second-guessing and feeling guilty about expressions of love and affection that would be completely normal in any other context. The psychological pressure was intense and constant. We were expected to maintain a cheerful, enthusiastic demeanor at all times, regardless of how we actually felt. Expressions of sadness, frustration, or doubt were seen as evidence of spiritual weakness that needed to be corrected through increased study, more prayer, and greater submission to organizational authority. A true Christian should be joyful in all circumstances, we were taught. If you're feeling discouraged or unhappy, it's because you're not properly focused on spiritual things. The solution is never to change your circumstances, but to change your attitude. This philosophy created a culture where genuine emotions were suppressed and authentic communication became nearly impossible. Everyone learned to wear a mask of contentment and enthusiasm, regardless of what they were actually experiencing internally. Rachel began to struggle particularly with this environment. She was naturally sensitive and empathetic, qualities that had made her an effective pioneer in field service but that made the rigid, impersonal atmosphere at Bethel especially difficult for her to navigate. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she told me one night, crying quietly so as not to disturb our neighbors. "I can't be myself here. I can't express what I really think or feel. I'm becoming someone I don't recognize." I tried to comfort her, but I was struggling with similar feelings. The enthusiastic young man who had arrived at Bethel full of dreams and spiritual ambition was slowly being replaced by someone who had learned to suppress his authentic thoughts and feelings in favor of organizational conformity. The irony was painful. We had come to Bethel believing that we were entering a spiritual paradise where we could grow closer to God and serve Him more effectively. Instead, we found ourselves in an environment that seemed designed to break down individual identity and replace it with institutional loyalty. By our third year at Bethel, the cracks in our idealistic view of the organization were becoming impossible to ignore. The incidents that shattered our illusions were not dramatic revelations, but rather a series of smaller events that gradually revealed the gap between the organization's public image and its internal reality. The first major shock came when our friend Michael Richardson was suddenly dismissed from Bethel. Michael had been one of the most dedicated brothers in our group of new arrivals, known for his enthusiasm, his knowledge of Scripture, and his willingness to work extra hours whenever needed. He had been assigned to the writing department, a position that was considered prestigious and was usually given only to brothers with exceptional spiritual qualifications. Michael had been struggling with depression for several months, a condition that he had tried to manage through prayer, increased study, and consultation with the elders. When his condition worsened to the point where it was affecting his work performance, he sought help from the Bethel Infirmary. Instead of receiving the compassionate medical care he needed, Michael was told that his depression was evidence of spiritual weakness and lack of faith. "A brother who truly trusts in Jehovah doesn't suffer from depression," he was told by Brother Patterson. "If you're feeling this way, it's because you're not properly focused on spiritual things." When Michael's condition continued to deteriorate and he began missing workdays, he was called before a committee of elders who informed him that his lack of spiritual strength made him unsuitable for Bethel service. He was given 2 weeks to pack his belongings and leave the facility. "They're sending me home like I'm some kind of spiritual failure," Michael told me the night before his departure, his voice filled with pain and confusion. "I've given everything I have to this organization. I've sacrificed everything for the privilege of serving here. And now they're treating me like I'm some kind of problem to be disposed of." The callousness of Michael's dismissal shocked those of us who had known him well. Here was a brother who had demonstrated years of faithful service, who had never violated any organizational rules, who had simply developed a medical condition that required understanding and treatment. Instead of receiving help, he was discarded as soon as he became inconvenient. "What happened to Michael could happen to any of us," Rachel said to me after his departure. "If you get sick, if you have personal problems, if you're not able to maintain their standard of performance, they'll throw you away without a second thought." The incident forced us to recognize that the loving brotherhood we had been promised was conditional on our continued usefulness to the organization. The moment we became a burden or a problem, that love and support would evaporate. Other incidents followed that reinforced this harsh reality. Brothers and sisters were dismissed for increasingly minor infractions, listening to music that was deemed inappropriate, socializing too frequently with members of the opposite sex, or asking questions that were interpreted as challenges to organizational authority. The fear created by these dismissals had a chilling effect on the entire Bethel family. Conversations became more guarded, expressions of individuality were suppressed, and everyone learned to carefully monitor their words and actions to avoid drawing unwanted attention from the overseers. At the same time, we began to notice the financial contradictions within the organization. While regular Bethel workers lived in Spartan conditions and received minimal allowances for personal expenses, enormous amounts of money were being spent on facilities and amenities for the leadership. The contrast was most visible during governing body meetings and special events, when we would see the expensive cars, elaborate meals, and luxurious accommodations provided for the organization's leaders. Meanwhile, workers like us were told that any desire for material comfort was evidence of spiritual weakness and lack of appreciation for our privileges. "Look at how simply Jesus lived," we were reminded constantly. "He had no place to lay his head, no material possessions, no concern for worldly comfort. That should be our example." But apparently, this example applied only to the rank-and-file workers. The leadership lived in comfort that Jesus never enjoyed, justified by the organization's teaching that they deserved special treatment because of their heavy responsibilities and important work. The hypocrisy became increasingly difficult to ignore or rationalize. We were supposed to be following an organization that taught simplicity, equality, and self-sacrifice, but the reality we observed daily contradicted every one of these principles. Years passed, and what had initially been intended as a temporary sacrifice became a permanent way of life. The dreams Rachel and I had harbored of eventually transitioning to other forms of service, perhaps returning home to raise a family or pursuing different types of ministry, gradually faded as we became trapped in the Bethel system. The organization made it clear that leaving Bethel was not simply a matter of choosing a different form of service. It was seen as a spiritual step backward, abandonment of privilege that reflected poorly on one's dedication and spiritual maturity. Brothers and sisters who left Bethel often faced years of suspicion and reduced standing in their congregations, as if they had somehow failed in their service to God. Once you've been privileged to serve at Bethel, we were taught, any other form of service will feel inadequate. Why would you want to give up the opportunity to work directly with God's organization in favor of some lesser assignment? This teaching created a psychological trap that made leaving extremely difficult, even for those who were deeply unhappy with their circumstances. The fear of being viewed as spiritually weak or unfaithful kept many workers at Bethel long after they had lost their enthusiasm for the work. Rachel and I found ourselves in this exact situation by our 7th year at Bethel. We had both begun to question many aspects of the organization's teachings and practices, but the fear of the consequences of leaving kept us paralyzed and unable to make a change. Rachel's health had begun to deteriorate significantly due to the years of physical labor and chemical exposure in the laundry facility. She had developed chronic respiratory problems, back pain that kept her awake at night, and severe anxiety that manifested as panic attacks during particularly stressful periods. When she requested a transfer to a less physically demanding assignment, she was told that such requests showed a lack of appreciation for her current privilege and that she needed to pray harder for contentment with her circumstances. "Sister Miller," Brother Patterson told her during a counseling session, "Jehovah has placed you in your current assignment for a reason. Rather than complaining about the challenges, you should be grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate your faithfulness through endurance." The organization's response to Rachel's health problems was typical of their approach to any issue that might interfere with productivity or efficiency. Individual needs and concerns were always subordinated to organizational priorities, regardless of the personal cost to the workers involved. I was struggling with my own health issues by this time. Years of repetitive motion and poor ergonomics in the bindery had resulted in chronic pain in my hands, wrists, and shoulders. I had also developed hearing problems from the constant noise in the factory environment, but requests for protective equipment or modified duties were consistently denied. These are minor inconveniences compared to the suffering that Jesus endured, we were reminded when we raised concerns about working conditions. A true Christian should be willing to endure any hardship in service to Jehovah. But perhaps more damaging than the physical deterioration was the psychological and spiritual erosion we were experiencing. The constant pressure to suppress our authentic thoughts and feelings, the demand for unquestioning obedience to organizational authority, and the growing awareness of the contradictions between the organization's teachings and practices were taking a severe toll on our mental and emotional well-being. We had entered Bethel as idealistic young people full of faith and enthusiasm for spiritual service. Over the years, that enthusiasm had been systematically crushed and replaced with a weary resignation that we tried desperately to disguise as contentment. The saddest part was watching the same transformation occur in other couples and individuals around us. The bright-eyed young people who arrived each year would gradually lose their spark and become part of the gray, institutionalized population that formed the bulk of the long-term Bethel family. Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if we had made different choices? Rachel asked me one evening as we sat in our small room, both of us too exhausted from the day's work to do much more than stare at the walls. It was a question I had been asking myself with increasing frequency, but it was dangerous to voice such thoughts even to each other. The organization taught that questioning past decisions was evidence of spiritual instability and lack of faith in God's guidance. We made the right choice, I said automatically, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. We're serving Jehovah in the best way possible. But privately, I was beginning to wonder if we had made a terrible mistake that had cost us the best years of our lives. The years continued to pass with a numbing regularity. By our 15th year at Bethel, we had become part of the institutional furniture, long-term workers who could be relied upon to perform their duties without complaint or question. We had learned to navigate the complex social and political dynamics of Bethel life, to avoid drawing unwanted attention, and to maintain the appearance of contentment and enthusiasm regardless of our private thoughts and feelings. But the cost of this adaptation was enormous. We had become strangers to ourselves and, in many ways, to each other. The passionate young couple who had arrived at Bethel full of dreams and love had been replaced by two middle-aged people who shared a room and a history but had lost touch with their authentic selves and their genuine feelings for each other. The organization had achieved exactly what it wanted from us: complete compliance and productivity with no inconvenient demands for individual recognition or personal fulfillment. We had become perfect institutional workers, interchangeable parts in a machine designed to produce literature and maintain organizational control. The irony was that during this period, we were often held up as examples of successful Bethel service. Younger workers were encouraged to model themselves after couples like us who had demonstrated faithfulness through years of dedicated service. We were asked to share our experiences at special events and to counsel new arrivals about the privileges of Bethel life. Playing this role required us to publicly praise an experience that was privately destroying us. We learned to speak enthusiastically about sacrifices that had brought us no joy, to describe as privileges what we increasingly recognized as exploitation, and to encourage others to make the same mistakes we had made. Serving at Bethel has been the greatest blessing of our lives, I would tell audiences of wide-eyed young people at conventions and special events. We've learned that true happiness comes not from pursuing personal goals but from dedicating your entire life to Jehovah's service. But even as I spoke these words, I knew they were lies. True happiness was something we had lost years ago, sacrificed on the altar of organizational loyalty and institutional demands. Rachel's physical and emotional health continued to deteriorate. The chronic respiratory problems had developed into a serious condition that required ongoing medical treatment, but the Bethel Infirmary was equipped only to handle minor ailments and injuries. Serious medical care required special permission and often resulted in criticism for allowing health problems to interfere with service. Her anxiety had evolved into full-blown depression, a condition that she struggled to hide because of the organization's attitude toward mental health issues. The fate of our friend Michael years earlier had taught us that admitting to psychological problems was tantamount to admitting spiritual failure. "I feel like I'm dying inside," she confessed to me one night during our 20th year at Bethel. "I wake up every morning and I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to go to work, I don't want to go to meetings, I don't want to pretend anymore that this is a good life." I held her as she cried, but I had no words of comfort to offer because I was experiencing the same feelings. We were both trapped in a life that was slowly killing us, but we couldn't see any way out that wouldn't result in even greater loss and suffering. The organization had effectively isolated us from any support system outside of Bethel. We had lost touch with most of our family and friends from home, partly due to the demands of Bethel life and partly due to the organization's teaching that such relationships should be secondary to our institutional commitments. Our parents had aged and died while we were at Bethel, and we had been granted only minimal time off to attend their funerals. Even in grief, we were expected to maintain our work schedules and meeting attendance, as if mourning the loss of loved ones was a self-indulgent distraction from more important spiritual duties. Your parents are sleeping in death, waiting for the resurrection, we were reminded. Excessive grief shows a lack of faith in Jehovah's promises. The best way to honor their memory is to continue faithful in your service. This cold, institutional response to normal human emotions and needs was characteristic of the organization's approach to every aspect of personal life. Individual feelings, needs, and relationships were always subordinated to organizational priorities, no matter how unreasonable or damaging such demands might be. The event that finally began to crack our psychological chains occurred during our 28th year at Bethel, when the organization announced that it would be selling the Brooklyn headquarters and relocating to a new facility in Warwick, New York. The move was presented as a spiritual advancement, a step toward greater efficiency and effectiveness in carrying out the organization's worldwide mission. But for those of us who had spent our entire adult lives within the walls of the Brooklyn complex, the announcement felt like another betrayal. The buildings we had been told represented the very center of God's earthly organization, the place where we had been privileged to serve for nearly 3 decades, were suddenly revealed to be nothing more than real estate assets to be liquidated for profit. The preparations for the move revealed the enormous wealth that the organization had accumulated over the decades. Properties that had been purchased for minimal amounts in the 1960s and 1970s were now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The sale of the Brooklyn facilities alone would generate enough money to fund the organization's operations for years to come. Where did all this money come from? Rachel asked me as we watched crews cataloging furniture and equipment in preparation for the move. We've been living like paupers while the organization has been accumulating hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate. It was a question that forced us to confront the reality of what the Watchtower organization actually was. Not a spiritual paradise or a religious brotherhood, but a sophisticated corporation that had built its wealth through the unpaid labor of thousands of workers like us. For nearly 30 years, we had worked without compensation beyond basic room and board, believing that we were making spiritual investments that would be rewarded in God's new world. But the vast wealth being revealed through the property sales made it clear that our labor had been generating enormous profits that were being used for purposes far removed from the spiritual welfare of individual believers. The move to Warwick was traumatic for most of the long-term Bethel workers. We were uprooted from the only home we had known for decades and transported to a sterile new facility that felt more like a corporate campus than a spiritual headquarters. Many of the workers who had devoted their entire adult lives to the Brooklyn operation were deemed unnecessary for the streamlined Warwick facility and were simply dismissed without ceremony or compensation. After 32 years of faithful service, one dismissed worker told me bitterly, "They gave me a handshake and a 2-week notice. No pension, no severance, no recognition of what I've contributed. Just, thanks for your service, and may Jehovah bless your future endeavors." The callousness of these dismissals forced us to confront the reality that we were not cherished family members, as the organization constantly claimed, but disposable employees who could be discarded the moment we became inconvenient or unnecessary. The new Warwick facility was impressive in its modernity and efficiency, but it lacked any warmth or character. Everything was designed for maximum productivity and control, with even less privacy and individual space than we had experienced in Brooklyn. The message was clear. Workers were expected to be grateful for any accommodation, no matter how minimal or dehumanizing. During this period of upheaval, I began to do something I had been afraid to do for years. I started researching the organization's history and teachings independently, using the internet access that was available in the Warwick facility's library. What I discovered shattered the last remnants of my faith in the organization's divine authority. I learned about the organization's history of failed prophecies, changed doctrines, and covered-up scandals. I read about former members who had been disfellowshipped for asking the same questions that were troubling me. I discovered that many of the teachings I had accepted without question for decades had no solid biblical basis and had been changed multiple times to suit organizational convenience. Most disturbing were the accounts I found of the organization's handling of child abuse cases. Stories of victims who had been silenced and abusers who had been protected to preserve the organization's reputation. The contrast between the organization's public claims of moral purity and the reality of its internal practices was staggering. "Rachel," I said one evening after returning from one of these research sessions, "I think we've been living a lie." The decision to leave Bethel after 36 years was the most difficult choice Rachel and I had ever faced. We were in our mid-50s, with no financial resources, no careers, no home outside of the institutional walls we had called home for over 3 decades. The prospect of starting over at our age was terrifying. But the alternative, continuing to live a lie, continuing to support an organization whose true nature we now understood, continuing to waste whatever years we had left in service to a cause that had already stolen our youth, was even more terrifying. The organization made it clear that our departure would not be treated as a simple career change or relocation. We were abandoning our spiritual privileges, disappointing Jehovah, and setting a bad example for other workers. We were told that our departure would be viewed as evidence of spiritual weakness and that we should not expect a warm welcome in any congregation we might attend in the future. "You're making a serious mistake," Brother Patterson told us during our final meeting with the Bethel administration. "You've been privileged to serve at the very center of God's organization for over 30 years. Nothing you do with the rest of your lives will ever compare to what you're giving up." But his words no longer had power over us. We had finally awakened to the reality that the privileges we were abandoning were actually chains that had bound us to a life of exploitation and control. The process of leaving was cold and bureaucratic. After 36 years of service, we were given 2 weeks to pack our belongings and vacate the premises. There was no retirement party, no recognition of our decades of contribution, no assistance in transitioning to life outside the organization. We were simply processed out like any other former employees who had outlived their usefulness. Our fellow workers were afraid to openly express sympathy or support for our decision, knowing that any association with spiritual defectors could affect their own standing within the organization. The friendships we had built over decades evaporated overnight, replaced by careful distance and institutional loyalty. On our final day, as we loaded our few possessions into a rental car, I looked back at the Warwick complex one last time. For 36 years, those buildings had represented everything we believed in, everything we had worked for, everything we had sacrificed to achieve. Now they looked like what they really were, a corporate headquarters designed to generate wealth and maintain control over the lives of believers. Today, as I finish writing this account, Rachel and I have been free from Bethel for 5 years. The transition to life outside the organization has been challenging in ways we never anticipated, but it has also been liberating beyond our wildest dreams. We live now in a small house in rural Missouri, not far from where we both grew up. We have a garden where we grow vegetables and flowers, something that was impossible during our decades in institutional housing. We cook our own meals, set our own schedules, and make our own decisions about how to spend our time and energy. Most importantly, we have begun to rediscover who we are as individuals and as a couple, separate from the institutional identities that were imposed on us for so many years. We are learning to think for ourselves, to express our authentic feelings, and to make choices based on our own values rather than organizational demands. The process of healing from 3.5 decades of institutional control has been difficult and ongoing. We both struggle with anxiety and depression that stem from years of psychological manipulation and suppression of our authentic selves. We are learning to trust our own judgment after decades of being told that independent thinking was dangerous and unfaithful. We have also had to face the painful reality of what we lost during our years at Bethel. We never had children, believing that doing so would interfere with our spiritual service. We sacrificed our relationships with family and friends, our health, our financial security, and our individual dreams in service to an organization that viewed us as disposable resources. But we have also discovered something precious in our newfound freedom: the ability to live authentically, to make genuine choices, and to experience real love and friendship based on mutual respect rather than institutional obligation. We attend a small community church now, where the emphasis is on love, acceptance, and service to others rather than obedience to organizational authority. We have made friends who accept us for who we are rather than how well we conform to institutional expectations. We have learned to celebrate birthdays, holidays, and other expressions of human joy that were forbidden during our years as Jehovah's Witnesses. Looking back on our experience, I am struck by how completely we were deceived about the nature of the organization we served for so many years. We entered Bethel believing that we were joining a spiritual brotherhood dedicated to serving God and helping others. We discovered that we had actually joined a corporation designed to generate wealth and maintain control over the lives of its members. The tragedy is not just what happened to us, but what continues to happen to thousands of other young people who are being recruited into the same system of exploitation and control. They are told the same lies we were told, promised the same spiritual privileges we were promised, and asked to make the same sacrifices we made. My hope in sharing this story is that others might recognize the warning signs we missed and avoid making the same mistakes that cost us the best years of our lives. Organizations that demand absolute obedience, that discourage questioning or independent thinking, that isolate members from outside relationships and perspectives, that promise spiritual rewards for material sacrifices. These are not spiritual paradises but sophisticated systems of control. True spirituality, we have learned, is not about surrendering your individual identity to an organization or following the commands of human leaders without question. It is about developing your own relationship with God, treating others with genuine love and respect, and using your life to make a positive difference in the world around you. We cannot get back the 36 years we lost to the Watchtower organization, but we can make sure that the years we have left are lived authentically and freely. And perhaps by sharing our story, we can help others avoid the trap that captured us for so long. The walls of Bethel may have looked like protection and privilege from the inside, but they were actually a prison. The greatest gift we have received in our lives is the courage to walk away from that prison and discover what it means to be truly free. This memoir represents the personal experiences and recollections of the author. While every effort has been made to present events accurately, some names and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of individuals mentioned in the account.